It is right to rebel. So Robert F. Williams was the leader of the NAACP in North Carolina, Monroe, North Carolina. And he was marching to integrate the local swimming pools and protesting for the right of African Americans to attend and swim in these local swimming pools. He was protesting, and the Ku Klux Klan was threatening his family and was shooting at them. So he started an all-black chapter of the National Rifle Association. They started learning to have firearms. Eventually there was a shootout between the NAACP and the Ku Klux Klan. Robert F. Williams fled the United States after being charged. He fled to China. And it was in China that he actually was able to meet Mao. There's a very famous photo of Mao with Robert F. Williams. And at the request of Robert F. Williams, Mao wrote a statement to support Martin Luther King's 1963 March on Washington. The I Have a Dream speech was given at this march. And Mao writes, "On behalf of the Chinese people, I wish to take this opportunity to express our resolute support for the American Negroes in their struggle against racial discrimination and for freedom and equal rights. There are 19 million Negroes in the United States, or about 11% of the total population. They are enslaved, oppressed, and discriminated against. Such is their position in society. The overwhelming majority are deprived of their right to vote. In general, only the most backbreaking and despised jobs are open to them. Their average wages are barely a third and a half of those of white people. Proportional unemployment." He says, "But the American Negroes are awakening, and their resistance is growing stronger and stronger. Recent years have witnessed a continuous expansion of their mass struggle against racial discrimination and for freedom and equal rights. A gigantic and vigorous nationwide struggle is going on in every city and state, and the struggle is mounting. The American Negro organizations have decided to start a Freedom March on Washington, August 28th, in which 250,000 people will take part. The speedy development of the American Negroes is a manifestation of sharpening class struggle and sharpening national struggle within the United States. Among the whites in the United States, it is only the reactionary ruling circles who oppress the Negro people. They can in no way represent the workers, the farmers, the revolutionary intellectuals, and other enlightened persons who comprise the majority of American white people. At present, it is only a handful of imperialists headed by the United States and their supporters and reactionaries in different countries who are oppressing, committing aggression against, and menacing the overwhelming majority of the nations and the peoples of the world." That's Mao's statement that he made for Martin Luther King Jr.'s famous march. And 10,000 copies of it were distributed to the marchers, and they were distributed by members of Youth Against War and Fascism, which was the youth group of the Workers' World Party at the time. And they distributed many, many copies of it. And what was interesting was, at that point, so the Communist Party had maintained in the 1930s that black people were a nation, right? And that they had the right to self-determination as a nation. Earl Browder kind of backed away from that. Then, when Earl Browder was overthrown, that was a main point in reestablishing the Communist Party, was re-emphasizing that position, Claudia Jones and others. So then, in 1956, the Communist Party of the United States was cast into crisis because of the Khrushchev secret speech and the 20th Party Congress. And there was a fight not just about Stalin and the Soviet Union and Marxism-Leninism, but one of the points of disagreement was the Black Belt. And should the Communist Party orient itself towards supporting Martin Luther King, who was not a black nationalist, who maintained that black people were simply the same nationality as people in the United States, they just faced discrimination? Or should the Communist Party orient itself toward figures like Malcolm X and black nationalists? And that was a debate. And ultimately, the folks who didn't think black people constituted a nation won out, and in 1956, or 1957, at the 57 convention, the Communist Party officially dropped its support for black nationalism and gave its support to the Civil Rights Movement. Well, in 1962, there was a group of African American activists, many of which were part of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and they had been members of the Young Communist League, a lot of them, but they supported black nationalism. So they gathered at Central Ohio University, or Central State University in Ohio, to form something called the Revolutionary Action Movement. And it was an effort to form a new communist party that would be sympathetic to black nationalism. And interestingly, Malcolm X actually symbolically made a point of joining them. He never actually, he wasn't really active, but he made a point of coming to their meetings and saying that he supported them in the final years of his life, which I think is fascinating. And that the position of supporting black nationalism became kind of a divide between the Communist Party, which supported the Civil Rights Movement and opposed black nationalism, and more radical forces. Now we know in the 1960s there was something called Students for a Democratic Society. And this was early in the 1960s. The United Auto Workers Union had provided the funding to forces to meet at Port Huron and form kind of a liberal activist group that believed in the civil rights movement and opposed like expanding wars in the Vietnam War. Tom Hayden, other forces were involved in it. And originally, Students for a Democratic Society had a ban on, you could not be a communist and join. However, communists started joining Students for a Democratic Society. In 1965, they formally lifted the ban, and many communists joined this mass activist group called Students for a Democratic Society. For a while, it had been funded by the United Auto Workers. As it got more radical, they cut off their funding, but it had already grown in big numbers. There was a grouping called the Progressive Labor Party, and that was a group of young people, or people who had been in the Communist Party, who broke away and they wanted to form a more radical Communist Party that would be aligned with China. They joined Students for a Democratic Society en masse. They had a faction that they called the Workers' Student Alliance, and their idea was for these young people who were students who were part of the group, the idea was they would go get jobs in factories and form a Workers' Student Alliance. That was their feeling. Now, it's important to talk about what was happening in China, and I'm going to talk about the Sino-Soviet split. So we know, as early as 1950, the US government was trying to divide China and the Soviet Union. In fact, the New York Times in 1950 it wrote, "The United States' aim is to drive a wedge between the Chinese and the Russians." This was widely acknowledged. The idea that China and Russia, two huge countries, were led by communist parties and were aligned. That had a lot to do with the humiliating defeat of the United States in the Korean War. That had a lot to do with what was happening around the world. And the New York Times admitted as early as 1950 that there was an effort by the US government to drive a wedge. Well, 1956, you had the 20th Party Congress. Stalin has died. Khrushchev, opens the Party Congress, and he gives this tirade against Joseph Stalin. And a lot of what Khrushchev says in the speech is documentedly false. Like, one thing that he says in his speech is that Stalin was so upset when he heard that Nazi Germany had invaded the Soviet Union that he began weeping and crying and hiding under his desk. Well, anyone who knows anything about Stalin knows that that's complete malarkey. Stalin was a bank robber at one point in his life, would walk into banks with guns and rob people at gunpoint. So the idea that he heard about an army thousands of miles away and just broke down sobbing is just completely ridiculous. But why did Khrushchev say this? Why did he say this? Well, he's trying to tell the United States that Stalin was not a good ally during the Second World War. And that the secret speech in 1956 was mainly Khrushchev groveling before the United States and sending the message, so sure, Stalin before me was this crazy revolutionary and all this, but I'm sympathetic. I want to hold off world revolution, and that seems to be a main thesis of Khrushchev, is the idea that people around the world shouldn't take up arms. People in South Africa and elsewhere shouldn't take up arms because the USA has the atomic bomb. It's too dangerous. And he seems to be urging communists around the world not to challenge US power and trying to negotiate some kind of deal where the USA will be friendly. And many people see it as almost like a deal. It was like Khrushchev was saying to the United States, I'll hold off revolutions in the third world if you'll be friendlier to me. It was kind of a block, right? So then China, clearly there's criticism there. At first, China kind of embraces Khrushchev a little bit. They publish some documents that are critical of Stalin. But starting in 1960, you start seeing the publication of big kind of manifestos from the Chinese Communist Party that are critical of the Soviet Union. One of them is called Long Live Leninism, and it's published in 1960. And if you read it, it's a reiteration of this call for anti-imperialist revolution and such. The things that Khrushchev was trying to tone down, they're emphasizing. 1962, they publish a very big pamphlet called The Difference Between Comrade Tagliati and Us. And it's an attack on the leader of the Italian Communist Party, who is very well promoted by the Soviet Union. And it's a subtle way of saying we don't agree with the Soviet Union. 1963, China publishes, and it's personally written by Mao Zedong, Proposal Concerning the General Line of the International Communist Movement. And they're urging the Soviet Union and other countries around the world to wage a campaign against what they call revisionism, which is people not believing in Marxism and selling out and opportunism. And it seems like China is pretty clear that they feel like the Soviet Union is betraying people around the world that are fighting for their national liberation and independence. And at the same time, as a result, China is receiving lots of Soviet aid to build buildings and build some of the first power plants. And at first, that's going very, very well. And Mao builds a huge amount of power plants all across China. Mao, brings, some tractors, iron oxen, they call them, tractors, to help people farm. And there's a lot of things that are being done in those early years that are very important, right? The scourge of drug addiction was wiped out in the 1950s during this time. I mean, opium addiction was just completely wiped out. Prostitution and venereal disease was wiped out in mass campaigns, and huge things are being done. These barefoot doctors are created. These are doctors, who go to these remote rural villages where people have never seen a medical professional in their lives and start giving people medical care. And they're achieving a lot of big things in terms of economics, but when the Soviet Union pulls out their aid, that's a big loss, and it causes some big problems. And there's a feeling in China that the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party is becoming bureaucratic. So what's bureaucracy? Now this is an important thing that we have to talk about. So when you have a socialist country, right? Every country that has ever had socialism has been building socialism on the basis of underdevelopment, right? Marx thought the socialist revolutions would happen in the Western countries that were already developed, but it's actually been in the countries that are underdeveloped that have had socialism. So socialism has been built on the basis of scarcity, right? And the analogy that is given is if you have a shortage of food, you're going to have to ration food to make sure people have enough to eat. So in order to ration the food, you're going to have a line, right? Where people are going to have to get in a line and get their ration of food. But then any line is going to have a guard who makes sure that no one takes anyone else's food and makes sure everyone gets what they need. But that guard is going to demand a bigger slice of food for taking on the responsibility of being a guard. And that's the basis of bureaucracy. And when you're building socialism on the basis of low levels of development, you're going to have some level of bureaucracy. So then the question becomes, how do you control the bureaucracy? How do you make sure that the bureaucracy doesn't just overthrow socialism and become the new ruling class? Well, in the Soviet Union, they wrangled with this, right? 1921, the Bolshevik Party had its famous party purge, where they kicked out millions of people. All these people had joined the Bolsheviks right after the Russian Revolution, didn't believe in communism. It's just, oh, well, the Russian Revolution happened, they're the new ruling party, I guess I'll sign up. So millions of people were expelled, and people were re-allowed to enter when it was clear they agreed with the Bolshevik Party program. From 1920 to 1932, they had something called the party maximum, which was like the highest income you could have. If you were a member of the Communist Party, you could not have above a certain income level, and that was the idea, was to keep the party pure. And essentially what was developed in the 1930s was kind of a police state apparatus in the Soviet Union. The idea being making sure that leaders of the Communist Party were not traitors and sellouts, and that escalated. People talk about Yezhovshchina or the Great Terror, and there were times where that was very intense. But the idea was Stalin and leaders of the Soviet Communist Party were trying to make sure that the Communist Party of the Soviet Union stayed true to Marxism. Well, 1961, China had cut ties with the Soviet Union, and Khrushchev was engaging in de-Stalinization. So China is criticizing the Soviet Union. And Lin Biao, who is a general, he was on the Long March with Mao, he puts together a book, right? The Red Army, the idea of the Red Army is that the Red Army is a political army. It's not just an apolitical army. Our military in the USA is not supposed to be political. It's not supposed to have any political loyalties. Well, even still today in China, the People's Liberation Army is loyal to the party, not even the elected government. Very interesting. And so, to give political training to the soldiers, Lin Biao puts together this book. And originally it's blue. It's just quotations from Chairman Mao, right? And he assembles it, and it's quotes from Mao. And eventually they start introducing it to the population at large. They make it red, so it's more communist. And you have the little red book that was distributed, right? Then, 1966, at a university in China, the students feel like the professors are not teaching in line with communism. They're teaching the old way. So they're protesting, and they're hanging up these posters on their campus to criticize their professors. And there's some feeling that they should be arrested for doing this. This is disruption. This is a problem. So Mao and Lin Biao show up at the campus and very symbolically bring a poster of their own and hang it up. And that poster says, Marxism consists of 1,000 truths, but they all boil down to a single phrase. It is right to rebel. Right? And this is the slogan. And this is the launching of the great proletarian cultural revolution. And the idea is that the party leadership is bureaucratic, is not taking the revolutionary line. So Mao and Lin Biao are leading this uprising among young people who will overthrow the capitalist, what they call the capitalist rotors in the party, and keep the bureaucracy and keep the party true to the communist line. 1967, the next year, you have something called the January Storm. And that's in the city of Shanghai. The young cultural revolutionaries overthrow the government, and they establish the Shanghai Commune. And they say that they want all of China to stop having elected governments and have it, kind of a workers' cooperative regime all over the country. Mao disagrees with Lin Biao and says, actually, the Shanghai Commune is a little bit too chaotic, and he proposes that they have instead what he calls the 3-in-1 combination. For every factory, they have an elected worker from the factory who's in charge, they have a technician who makes sure things are good, and then they have a political representative from the Communist Party. Not direct worker management of the factory, but this 3-in-1 combination. And at various times in the cities in China, the fighting gets so intense that actually factory workers are going out to stop the students from killing each other. And students it's very violent. And it's extremely chaotic. And William Hinton, the American writer, he's living in China at the time, and he's observing this. And in the United States, many left-wing activists and students are very inspired by the Cultural Revolution that's happening. The Progressive Labor Party in the United States, they support the Cultural Revolution. They think it's great. The Revolutionary Action Movement, they support it. The Workers' World Party supports it. And many point to it as proof that China is more revolutionary than the Soviet Union. And the Little Red Book, among Students for a Democratic Society activists, the Little Red Book becomes kind of almost like a thing that everybody has. And at SDS conventions, they're waving the Little Red Book around like they're in China. And in the United States, anti-Vietnam War protests and black liberation protests are really escalating. October 21st, 1967, hundreds of thousands of people march against the Vietnam War. Abby Hoffman is a countercultural figure who leads a breakaway march, and they go to the Pentagon, and they're protesting at the Pentagon. And Abby Hoffman is this kind of cultural figure. He says he has something called the Youth International Party. Another figure associated with it is Jerry Rubin. And they are promoting drug use. They think drug use is very revolutionary. And interestingly, there's a TV interview with Phil Donahue, where Jerry Rubin's being interviewed by Phil Donahue.
Can we take another one? Hi, you had a brief question for Jerry Rubin.
Yes, Mr. Donahue. First of all, I'd like him to know that that he is speaking to one of his peers. I'm 23 years old and I'm a college graduate, and I followed his movement closely. And since he seems to advocate man's humanity to man, I would appreciate his being more polite to me than he has been to previous callers. First of all, Mr. Rubin, how long do you think you would stay alive were you to advocate your policy in Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Russia, or Red China for that matter?
Well, I wouldn't be advocating when I'm advocating now. There, hey, why don't you finish, man? Why don't you let me finish? Huh? You're interrupting a lot. You're really interrupting a lot.
Go.
You're very nervous.
You're so nice to her, and you treat me... Okay, go ahead, talk to her. Go.
I advocate a revolution in all those countries except China. I advocate a revolution in those countries. I think that we need a world revolution. I think that's what's happening.
Basically, in the minds of the yippies, or the radical hippies, there was a feeling that China was the one true communist, society. And all over the United States, Students for a Democratic Society is growing in big numbers. Martin Luther King Jr. is assassinated on April 4th, 1968. He's assassinated, and in response, there's uprisings and rebellions in almost every major urban center of the United States. So Mao issues another statement supporting Martin Luther King. He says, some days ago, Martin Luther King Jr., the African-American clergyman, was suddenly assassinated by the U.S. imperialists. Martin Luther King was an exponent of nonviolence. Nevertheless, the U.S. imperialists did not, on that account, show any tolerance toward him, but used counter-revolutionary violence to kill him in cold blood. This has taught the broad masses of black people in the United States a profound lesson. It has touched off a new storm in their struggle against violent repression. The storm of the African-American struggle is taking place with the United States in a striking manifestation of the comprehensive and political and economic crisis now gripping U.S. imperialism. It is dealing a telling blow to U.S. imperialism. Mao is supporting the uprising. And it's interesting because if you read his statement, Mao makes it pretty clear. He's undisputed in his mind that the U.S. government killed Martin Luther King. And in the African-American community, that was the feeling in the United States. Among radical circles, that was the feeling, was that it was just assumed that it had been the U.S. government that had killed Martin Luther King. The final years of Martin Luther King's life, he was, speaking against capitalism, denouncing the Vietnam War, saying that the USA needed to adopt a democratic form of socialism. I know the filmmaker Michael Moore tells the story of when he was a teenager. The night Martin Luther King was killed, somebody was out at their car, was heating up their car, and heard on the radio outside of the church that Martin Luther King had been killed. And so when the crowd of people were coming out of the church after the evening prayer service, the person shouted, someone shot Martin Luther King, and all the people coming out of the church in this very small town in Michigan, it was very conservative, all started applauding. And there was a feeling among the conservatives in the United States that Martin Luther King should be killed, and the FBI had gone after him, right, COINTELPRO. And so Martin Luther King's assassination touches off a huge storm of rebellions. In April, later that year, Columbia University is shut down by protests by Students for a Democratic Society because the university is planning to build a new gym and evict a whole bunch of residents of Harlem